Last Thursday, I once again made the treacherous trip up to Bamburgh on the northeast coast. This time, rather than going all the way to Bamburgh, I stopped at an unassuming farm and started walking. It was a glorious morning, and I walked for around 10 to 15 minutes through the fields. You see, I wanted to revisit the Bradford Kaims, which we had filmed briefly the week prior. When Mrs. Soup and I were last here, with Indy the dog, there was a Land Rover waiting at the farm for drivers to the site. Clearly, Mr. Soup on his own isn't quite so special. Now, obviously I'm only joking. The walk actually was lovely, and after all, most of the team make this walk twice a day, to and from their cars. And here we are, at the top of the Kaim, looking down on the site. The team keep their bags safe in the tent, and all important tea-making facilities are in the caravan. There's also, mercifully, a portaloo on site.
Morning.
So, without any further ado, let's head on over to the first trench. It's over this way.
Okay, my name's Tom Gardner. I'm the trench supervisor, area supervisor of Trench 6 here and Trench 10 down at the bottom at the northern area of the Bradford Kaims. I'm just going to give you a quick chat through the archaeology which we've got here. This trench is the largest which we have open on site and have ever had open on site. It's been under excavation for about 4 years now, and it's got to a considerable size. It's our biggest open area excavation, and it's wonderful to be able to deal with the archaeology in an open area. That's quite a rare thing to be able to do with prehistory, so we're pretty blessed that we have the time and the effort to be able to do that. In the centre of it, you'll be able to see quite clearly a series of burnt mounds. We've now worked out actually we've got 6 burnt mounds in one sequence. Generally this would count as one burnt mound, but these seem to be distinct depositional episodes, and they're all very distinct from each other, both in their matrix and in their inclusions. So that's pretty ace to get them stacked across the trench. We've also got a number of troughs in here related to the burnt mounds, obviously. We've got one earlier clay-lined trough down in the southern part of the trench here, associated with a series of pits and stake holes and post holes. And then in the northern part of the trench, 3 intercutting wood-lined troughs, 2 of which are plank-lined, and the third of which is made out of a whole oak trunk which has been hollowed out all the way through and set vertically in the ground, which is pretty incredible. So we've got all that part of the process, all the detrital material and the processing areas. What we unfortunately lack, as all burnt mounds do really, from within the burnt mound contexts, is artifactual material. These are generally very sterile deposits, and that's what we have here, is general sterility. We've got a couple of pieces of ceramic from the base of the mound giving us a firm early Neolithic date for its earliest deposition, which turns in, works with an archaeomagnetometric date we've got from halfway through it of 4,350 BC. So it's an early Neolithic burnt mound or burnt mound sequence. We've got a couple of bits of flint from it, I think 14 in total, so really not very much. A couple of bone chips. And that's really it, apart from the only artifactual material we have lots of is stuff we shouldn't have any of at all, which is cannel coal and sea coal. We have a huge amount of cannel coal, approaching 200 pieces now, and 40% of it is burnt. And that comes in a very localised area in our earliest burnt mound deposit. The earliest use we can find of this stuff across Europe is in the Roman period, and yet we seem to have a lot of it in our early Neolithic context in here, which is pretty incredible to get. It doesn't mean that it's essentially being used, but it has to mean that it's being brought here. I suppose a tsunami could bring it in, but we've got no evidence of a tsunami on site. It's just bound up tightly within the matrix of the mound, which is pretty phenomenal to have. So we're toying around with the idea that they may be using it as a fuel source. I think more interestingly for me is the fact that it's very localised and it doesn't get used throughout the rest of the mound sequence. It's just a sort of single use thing. So it seems to go out of fashion. Potentially the currents change and it stops washing up on the beaches on the east coast, but I don't really know. That's something we need to investigate further, and it seems pretty closely tied in with a pit complex which we have, pit and state coal complex down in the southern area of the trench, some of which has got sea coal coming out of it now, which is quite interesting. Underneath these mounds across the whole trench we can probably see the nice orange colluvial materials, very clear, which actually has a huge number of stake holes and negative features cut into it, loads and loads and loads of them. There are some large pit posts and holes and things like that, loads of stake holes, some of them surrounding hearths and things like that. Quite nice architectural work. And we've got a couple of what seem like beam slots as well. We've not got all these in plan yet. We need to take off the mound, obviously, take it off in sequence, get all that rid first, so we can see it all in plan and get it all planned out before we dig any of it. But it seems like we've got quite intense activity, a lot of it structural, prior to the mound deposition. So it's got to be either early Neolithic or late Mesolithic. So that's the sort of body of the trench in here. Of course we've got our late Victorian pipe cuts which come through it all quite inevitably because we're in an area of land improvement. But I think most interestingly, when you go into the western part of the Trench 6 and into Trench 10, in our two extensions which you can see just there, we've got huge amounts of waterlogged deposits, which is really a phenomenal thing to have in a trench such as this, and they interact directly with our mound sequencing, so they're for a lot of the part of it they're contemporaneous. We put these extensions in a couple of years ago basically to try and associate the archaeology we had in the trench with stratified environmental deposits within a bottleneck, essentially waterlogged bottleneck in our large fenland which we have at the Kaims. And immediately upon doing so we came across huge amounts of archaeology. The vast majority of it looks like wooden platform material. We've got meters and meters and meters of it. I think now we've got a wooden platform at least 15 metres long, 10 metres wide and 3.5 metres deep, with various phases and deposits in it. It's full of nice worked planks and branches and brushwood, and there's stakes and posts pinning it down. It's got artifactual material like paddles and wood chips and scythe handles and things like that, and it's kind of a crazy thing to be able to excavate. And quite nicely, when we've gone through it, we see that the top 30 centimetres of it have got fire-cracked stones mixed into them. So from the mound, either tumble or stuff that they're moving hot stones out across the platform surface. But after that, underneath that, there's got metres and metres of no hot stones through our platform, which means that the platform has to be here prior to the mound deposition, and then they interface for a while and then it all goes out of use. That's quite interesting. I think at our lowest date which we have through the platform, which is not the lowest part of the platform, we've got a late Mesolithic radiocarbon date. So the platform seems to be being deposited for a couple of thousand years by itself. That's something we still need to test, and we still need to find the limits of it and all the extremes of it, but it seems to be a pretty intense area of activity directly associated in its later phases with the burnt mound activity up here. And that makes sense if you consider where we are in this landscape. We're sitting right at the bottleneck, at the thinnest part of our extensive fenland system. It'd be the easiest place to cross and to move across. There might be a little stream coming through here, so it'd be a pretty ideal place to be active. The platform seems to be being deposited first, so that's the primary usage, I think, is potentially this is a causeway going across this bottleneck, and then the mound comes in later in the series of mounds and the associated trappings, which I think is potentially to process something which may be being accessed or brought about by the occurrence of the platform, basically. The plans for the next couple of seasons are basically to expand even further. We've not got any of our mound sequences, the extent of them, so we need to go both south and north and extend the trench. It's already pretty sizable, but it needs to become a lot bigger. And equally open up more areas into this platform to see what it's like, how what its structural makeup is all the way through it, whether our planks turn into a plank causeway or not. that sort of thing, and hopefully find more dating evidence and more artifactual material within our planked areas, I think.
Now, let's go and take a closer look at that wonderful platform.
I'm Sophia Black, Assistant Supervisor at Trench 6, and this year on Trench 10. We're in the extension between Trenches 6 and 10 on top of the wooden platform that we've been excavating for a few years. This morning we uncovered a bone, potentially a femur, which has been hollowed out and cut. We've been finding a lot of hazelnut shells. Yesterday we managed to uncover about 18 hazelnut shells. The importance of that is that it gives us a specific seasonality of the potential occupation of the site. We will research more about the bone and potentially find out the use and how it relates to the rest of the things that we're finding on the site. Yet we don't know whether it's part of the structure or not, but there is a small stake that's been placed at one end of the bone, which potentially it could relate together. They could mean something together, or it could just be accidental. We don't know for sure yet.
So they just found a bone, eh? No wonder Cuthbert the dog is so interested. Anyway, let's head off across a modern field boundary to the next trench. In walking in this direction, we're actually heading out into ancient fenland, away from what would have been dry land.
I'm Graham Dixon. Well, it's near the end of the 7th week of the season, so we're quite close to the end. This is Trench 11, and this is a brand new trench this year. So Trench 11 has been located on a rise in the landscape which runs in a linear towards the platform in Trench 6. And it heads between two trees over there, comes out behind me, changes direction slightly out into the fen, goes for another 20 meters or so, then it changes direction again, and then it stops at a mound or a small island just over there between us and the sheep. And that mound and others in it are made up of stone. Behind this trench we had a test pit, and there were stones in that, this sort of size, up to about waist height. And you can see the sort of size stones that are in the section behind me next to where Shane is. That's the sort of stones that we were seeing in that islandette. And we've interpreted these as being artificial mounds. What those mounds are for is still up for debate. It appears in the landscape as a rise, and what we're presuming is happening is these islandettes, similar to crannogs, where the stones are being deposited in a lake, we've got stone mounds deposited into our fen, and they're connected by this raise in the landscape, and that's formed from wood, sand and stone all along its length. And we've put auger cores through this length, along a transect, straight through this trench, and we've seen at a depth I think of about 2 meters, 2.5 meters, there are large timbers. Sitting on top of those timbers is brushwood and laid timbers similar to what you're seeing in Trench 6 platform. Then there's a layer of peat about 1/2 meter thick, and then there's another layer of 1/2 meter worth of platform. What it appears is happening is that a causeway or a platform has been laid out into the fen, connecting up these individual islands of stone, laid down onto large timbers. You've got brushwood laid onto that as it sinks down into the fen. Then peat starts to form again. So that presumably means that it's gone out of use. And then we don't know how long that peat has taken to form. People have come back, decided to use the same area again, or the same rise in the landscape, to start laying brushwood down on top of again. We can see it today. So I'm imagining that the original platform would have created a rise in the landscape that would still have been existent. It may well have been that they just naturally kept using the slightly higher ground. We see it because the sheep walk on it when it's wet, because it's dry for them. That rise in the landscape, we're not entirely sure what creates it all the way along. Behind me, we used to have a sand bank that was raised up, and it looked like a big bank of sand had been deposited into the fen. And indeed, you can see all the timbers that are in the trench as well. So I wanted to just point out some of the timbers that are in this trench that interested us earlier. Some of them look like they're the sort of size timbers that you use for, they're structural essentially, that sort of size. You wouldn't be surprised to see these holding up small structures. So this large curved timber in front of me, ignoring the semicircular hole in it that was created by one of our auger cores, whereas down here it appears as though it's been chopped into. It looks like it's got an axe cut into it. It's quite a big one, quite a deep one. So it's possible that there's a human axe cut that's been chopped into there. Down here on my right, this one is a very long straight timber. It looks like it's been planked. It's ridiculously straight and long, and it continues into section. We don't know its full length yet. It comes up to about here and then continues into section. If you take out of account all these pieces of timber, they're sat proud. They're sat on small plinths. They're going to be lifted off today. If you remove these from your mind's eye, then the majority of timbers left in the trench are running on a north to south alignment. So that's that long one that I mentioned. There's one there next to it. That curved one with the axe cut, it's curved. You could claim it was on pretty much any alignment. But there are timbers up against the section wall, one of which looks like it's got a V-shape felling cut in it. That comes out a north to south angle. There's another one coming out of the northernmost section over there. And then there's just a plethora of other smaller pieces running north to south. Obviously there are other pieces that have been chucked in here, but I'll be quite interested to see what happens when we excavate down to a lower level, and when these timbers that are currently at ground level are raised up a bit, see what's actually going on underneath the rest of this timber. But that looks quite interesting at the moment.
Finally, we turn back away from the fenland towards a very interesting shelf on the edge of the dry land.
Hi, I'm Tom Lally. This is Trench 9 here at the Bradford Kaims. We started digging in this area 2 years ago when we were doing test pitting along this sort of bank that we've got here. We put a test pit over here and we came straight down onto part of a burnt mound. On top of that burnt mound we found a nice bit of burnt bone. It's the first bit of burnt bone we've found on this entire site, so we found this to be quite an important sort of area to look at. So the start of last year we opened up where the test pit was again and obviously expanded from there, making a 12 by 4 metre trench. Once revealed, we found the burnt mound to be in this sort of area. It wasn't necessarily very thick, but it was quite widespread. We found a laurel shaped arrowhead on the very top, which gave us a nice Neolithic date. In terms of the context of the makeup of the burnt mound itself, it was very sort of sparse and loose. There was bits of charcoal, there was lots of burnt rocks as well, but it wasn't overly concentrated. So we think that possibly this area was only used for a short amount of time. basically you can see we're on the sort of the edge of the fen here. We've got a natural sort of sloping down into what would have been peat bog and marsh. So our prehistoric people may have been smart and thought this may not be the perfect place to stick a burnt mound for very long. Last season as well, we found a nice assemblage of Bronze Age pot just off to my left here. It was about 35 pieces in a very small sort of concentrated area. We don't know whether it's necessarily related to our burnt mound, which is earlier, and whether people were still here doing the same burnt mound sort of process and that was part of it or not, we're not quite sure. As well as Bronze Age pot last year, up in that top area we found lots of flint finds. We found some nice thumb scrapers, some blades, lots of flakes, some micro scrapers, and even some microliths in the very top corner, which we at this stage have dated to Mesolithic purely on their form. We will hopefully get them analysed a bit harder and get some more affirmative sort of dates on that sort of thing, but at the moment we're happy to consider that area Mesolithic. This season we've obviously come back here again. We've found some very, very nice things this season. We've taken the burnt mound off, and underneath that we had just a big spread of clay. That's now off as well, and we've come down to this sort of layer across the whole trench, which we believe to be a Neolithic ground surface. Within this surface we've found some post holes cut in, some stake holes, which are basically temporary structures, possibly fish traps, possibly just staking out somewhere for a shelter, possibly just sort of windbreaks, possibly animal hides, you know, a drying rack, something like that. We've also found more flint finds on this layer as well, lots of worked pieces and that sort of thing. On this bottom sort of area of the trench, at the bottom of our sort of slope, we've found some nice patches of wooded areas. To my left over here we found a nice wooden plank about that long at the moment that's extending into the trench edge. There's a group of stake holes around that, which we think possibly the plank is part of a walkway across the bog that's in front of us and over to some high ground just behind you there. We intend on investigating that further. That may go into next season though, because we've only got 2 weeks left here. Our next wooded area is right in front of me here. There is a hearth feature just in front here as well, which we uncovered on Monday, purely accidental, but we're very glad we found it. It seems to be very heavily concentrated in charcoal. There's burnt stones in there as well, lots of burning sandstones. And yesterday we were lucky enough to find another piece of flint. It's been initially dated as well as Mesolithic, so that's the oldest hearth and feature that we've found at this site, which is pretty awesome. Just behind there's an assemblage of wood. At this stage we're still determining whether that is directly related to this hearth or not. There is a bit of clay band between it that we need to remove to see if that is directly related. At this stage it's looking quite convincing though, which is nice. Just in front of me here we found a collection of post holes. The really good thing about this is that the wood is still in situ. We've had about 4 or 5 pieces. There is a potential that it was just one post that has snapped quite a few times. Within the fill of those post holes we've found 3 pieces of bone or possibly horn that will need to be further analysed. And we also found a microlith halfway down, which once again, looking at its form, we're giving a Mesolithic date, so that's really, really, really nice. Down in this bottom corner we've got basically our peat sort of area. It's really waterlogged, really wet, really organic, really humic. At the moment we're starting to reveal quite a substantial amount of wood. We're not sure whether it's platform wood at this stage, but there's another potential that people have been, you know, putting stuff down as a form of trackway again over this boggy marsh. Within the peat itself we've now found 3 pieces, or 3 hazelnuts, one perfectly intact, which is really nice, and the other 2 just some shells. There is a very degraded piece of wood sort of to my right here as well, which is similar to the planks that are over in Trench 6. And the good thing about all these bits of wood, the wood here, the post hole, the plank, they're all going sort of that direction over to the high ground over there, which confidently gives us sort of a trackway sort of idea and mentality that we're thinking they're building something from this dry land and hard surface here over to what's behind you there, in terms of nice solid ground and a trackway across this pretty boggy marsh. When this area is wet, it is quite wet underfoot. Your feet sink, you can feel it sink. So it just makes sense to put a trackway across this if you're trying to get from one dry area to another.
And there we have it. That's the so-called Bradford Kaims being dug by the Bamburgh Research Project. These archaeologists are really an interesting bunch. They're doing an excellent job, and they're uncovering a site which could rival the likes of Star Car or Flag Fen, and all the while they're finding time to teach students who come to the site. I simply had to return and do this site justice. It's one of the most interesting prehistoric sites I've ever seen. If you want to know more about the Bamburgh Research Project, the Field School, or their blog, check out their website. Also, why not head over to their YouTube channel and click subscribe.
Really thick Australian accent. G'day guys and girls, how are we? Welcome to Trench 9.